system of freshwater lakes. On these lands, the Milwaukee, Menominee, and Kinnickinnick rivers meet, and the human and non-human people of Wisconsin's sovereign Anishinaabe, Ho-Chunk, Menominee, Oneida, and Mohican nations remain present. We're grateful to live and work alongside all of the diverse inhabitants of this place. Thanks. So I want to welcome Jairus Grove today. Jairus, international relations scholar and political theorist at University of Hawaii, did his PhD at Johns Hopkins, working with Jane Bennett, who some of you probably know or know of. And Jairus is we had a really nice walk-in talk today, and his life as an international relations scholar is like really
about plasticity in particular, and kind of how I read geopolitics. But the book basically starts with two problems. I guess all books kind of start that way. One of the problems, and they were both very kind of historical to the moment that I started writing. One of the problems was that the field of international relations had come to a consensus that war was statistically on the decline in the world. And none other than Pinker picked up on this and tried to convince us all that everything was getting better, don't you worry. My friend Jeff Epstein says it's a great place to live. So that seemed a patently absurd claim to me. But more importantly, the fact that it could be a consensus suggested to me that there was something about the way that we understood, measured, represented violence that was in serious need of an overhaul. Because what the actual data said was something about akin to the fact that we should be celebrating that there's a decline in catapult deaths. Right? It took an incredibly outmoded way of understanding violence, constricted what that meant, 300 battle deaths in one area between one or two, sometimes four different divisions of enmity over the course of less than 2 weeks. Right? So if you have, you basically, yeah, great. So that's not really the way that war was happening anymore. And I wanted to try to figure out both what the politics of understanding war that way were, but also how else we would try to conceptualize it. And so the book really puts war kind of at the center of theory, so much that I refer in the book to it as martial theory rather than political theory or ethical theory, because I think we have a tendency to make war because we hate it for good reason, but we tend to externalize war as a kind of pure instrumentality, right? So we don't have often in our language and our theory a correlate like we do between politics and the political, or between ethics and the ethical. War is just something we're supposed to be done with, and clearly we're not. And so I try to develop martial theory as a way of understanding, but also as a way of really taking war seriously as something that's not in the decline, but that I think is actually the determining feature of most relations on the planet, in fact. The second one equally struck ire in me, which was this idea that the Anthropocene was a geological fact. Right? We needed to accept that the Anthropocene was a real thing. If you said anything critical of the Anthropocene, you were sort of anti-science. And it was just like, it was in the soil, man. Like we can count it. And this wasn't true of people who were doing, using the Anthropocene as a provocation within the humanities, but in my job as a futurist, where I had to deal with people at the UN and other organizations, the Anthropocene was something like a kind of institutionalized version of climate change, which I thought was incredibly problematic. And they were really excited about it, which also seemed really problematic. In fact, the fact that they had a name for it and that it was human caused seemed more like good news than bad news. And so I wanted to get inside that concept, and you'll hear later about why they're really excited. But the short version is, well, if humans did it, well, I mean, how cool are humans? What else can they do? Maybe change the temperature, move the planet a little further from the sun. So yeah, it gets into some problems. So where does the book begin? Basically with this idea that things are really terrible right now. In fact, so they're really, really bad. And there is this sort of tendency, both in the humanities and the social sciences, to want to always start that conversation with the really bad and then immediately find a way, but don't worry, right? The dialectic will get us out. A new human-non-human relationship will get us out. Getting rid of dualisms will get us out. I don't know. Pick your favorite critical move. But it was really hard to get out of the redemptive space, particularly in a field like international relations, which is either highly technical or highly normative. So the people who talk about war and climate change either talk about it because they're waging the wars or literally fixing climate change, or highly normative people who are like, war is the worst thing ever. Anyone who does it, we don't want to speak to. It's just about being against war. And so this book tries to actually dwell a bit in how bad things are and not try to make the next move about how we're going to make things better. In part because I think there's an incredible geopolitics and a Eurocentric geopolitics in thinking that we have that kind of agency, and particular how it'll play out. So let's start with the first thing. What is the Anthropocene? I know everybody knows this, but I want to go through what it was in particular in kind of climate engineering as it was used as a technical term. So obviously the one which we're all familiar with, that humans made a geologically significant impact. And most of the beginnings of this claim, if we're looking at people like Paul Crutzen, was that it was a geological impact based on the concentration of carbon in the atmosphere, and therefore the ways in which that would be reflected in the geological record. In part, I think that already baked into some of the problem, right? It had this crazy relationship to temporality. We'll know the Anthropocene was really significant when we're all gone and somebody else finds us, right? Because obviously that geological layer isn't created yet. But more importantly, it tried to periodize this problem almost entirely around the problem of carbon. So basically industrialization, and for some the Capitalocene, is the way that we should date these things. And already for me, as someone who studies war all the time, that seems crazy. Because obviously the first major climate event that killed lots and lots of people happened in the Americas. It happened vastly before industrialization, and it was a result of first contact, right? So the first major climate event we have is because of the release of diseases and invasive species. It kills upwards of 20 million people, but more importantly, it destroyed all of the arable land because there were no people to farm it, and the reforestation caused a global ice age, a mini ice age, but an ice age nonetheless. And so to me, in some sense, the Anthropocene had baked into the concept this way of understanding Eurocentrism as the beginning of geological time, as opposed to thinking about settler colonialism as the kickoff to having global effects as a result of violence. And it skipped one. And the last one, which is number 4, which I'm not sure why it didn't work, is that it presumed already a very homogeneous notion of the anthro in the Anthropocene, which was used immediately to try to generalize responsibility, as if everyone, every place in the world had participated equally in the making of this era. And in part that was supposed to follow, hence at the UN, therefore we all have responsibility, right? We all have to bear the costs. And a lot of those people, Crutzen included, but David Keith, Brad Allenby, and Stuart Brand immediately saw this term as an accomplishment, right? Actually as evidence that humans had the agency to alter planets. And so Allenby, as early as 2002, made the claim that what this proved is that humans had always been geoengineering. We'd always been altering the planet. Which of course is strangely close in a weird way to the kind of Latourian arguments we make about the nature-culture distinction, but took it up a notch. Therefore, we should be engineering it better. So if we're altering the whole planet, then not only do we have a right, but we have an obligation to sort of steer the planet differently, right? So inspired by kind of mid-century futurists like Buckminster Fuller and others that wanted to think about world systems theory. And Crutzen in particular, who I talk about somewhat at length in the book, I guess most people probably know this at this point, but Crutzen developed all of his climate models. Does anybody know from what he was studying? The Adult Geopolitical paper, really? Nuclear winter. So all of the models to describe climate change were because he was studying nuclear winter. And interestingly, if anybody knows anything about nuclear winter, basically the reason it gets really cold is because you burn a bunch of buildings and concrete and trees, and all of that sort of exhaust from the destruction reflects sunlight. So like presto changeo, he goes from studying nuclear winter to studying climate change, and then after the Anthropocene goes from studying climate change to suggesting that we should cause nuclear winters. Right, so the main sort of proposal for geoengineering is that we should artificially produce that reflectivity, but not as much as a full nuclear exchange, and that will cool the planet. So I think in part the problem with the concept is that it was built to interface with a kind of version of the Earth that viewed it as an operating system. Right, this was sort of Buckminster Fuller's vision of it. That it was, we had gained the kind of knowledge where we couldn't just measure the fact that things were getting warmer, we could measure the processes that were causing them to get warmer, and because we understood those sufficiently, we should be able to intervene in them. And matter of fact, that was the role of governance. But of course, that's not where it stopped, right? Because one of the other reasons they liked it, which I'll get to more length at the end, is that climate engineering, unlike climate abatement, right, where we try to grow less, we try to burn less, we try to do less, can be done by a very small number of countries, as opposed to everyone cooperating. And so again, already the notion of the Anthropocene, universalizing a certain kind of humanity, dating it at a particular time, also building in a number of choice actors in the international system who were meant to take the lead, right? Which basically amounts to the United States and Europe. So geoengineering can be done without, right? It, in their words, gets over the collective action problems that plague politics. In fact, one of David Keith's essays is called Exit Politics, How Science Can Fix the Problems That Humans Can't. I think that's right. It's close. Close enough. So, many of these same thinkers, Stuart Brand most importantly, penned this thing called the Eco-Modernist Manifesto, in which they said that we needed to decouple from nature. That basically, right, Latour and others were right, there was no culture-nature distinction, and we needed one. And so there would be this great divorce. We'd put all the humans into just a few megacities. We'd run them on high-voltage nuclear power until we could figure out something else. And then we would let the rest of nature rewild. So E.O. Wilson gets involved in this. And the idea is the Anthropocene is a kind of invitation to a hyper-modernism in order to reproduce this. And so the end of nature thesis gets picked up by a lot of folks, and we basically end up with three different political possibilities. We have Walmart capitalism, so market economy with air conditioning. So we'll keep capitalism going, but we're going to do all these things to change the temperature, change the color of the atmosphere, and maybe put all of the old CDs out in space so that they will reflect sunlight. That is actually one of the proposals. Move the Earth a little bit further from the sun. We could probably do that. But the point was that we would change the temperature so that we wouldn't have to alter the mode of production, producing these kinds of effects. The second one, which is the sort of Stuart Brand school, I like to call Walmart Keynesianism, which is like state management of urban life and ecological management, right? This kind of, we'll allow for market economies to exist in the cities, but not in the forests. And in the forests, we're going to have hyper-vigilant anti-poaching, and basically everybody's got to move to the cities. If you're indigenous and you don't want to, tough luck. And then we get this version from the accelerationists of full unemployment and egalitarian total management of the Earth system, or Walmart communism. And of course, I'm stealing this from Jameson, who's like, Marxists should learn more from Walmart. It's awesome. It's the first planned economy. I don't disagree. That doesn't sound awesome to me. That sounds like a horror show. And this becomes kind of the vision of the Anthropocene, right? At least in public policy circles, as adopted by the Oxford Union of Scientists, as adopted by the most recent Paris climate talks. In fact, one of the reasons they agreed to the temperature they agreed to was because geoengineering was on the table. And so that significantly lowered the cost of meeting various kinds of climate goals. Ironic that then the United States pulled out anyway because it was totally weak tea, but that's just how Trump likes to do. So I wanted to try to figure out, in part, what would happen if we really thought this problem of the Anthropocene and climate change, if the world were run by psychopaths, because it has been for a very long time. So what I wanted to think about is not how climate change was sort of the problem that organized everything else, but that climate change was actually just one of the consequences of this period of rapid expansion out of Europe by vanguard, mostly, forms of settler colonialism, then modernization, then industrialization. And that's what we are confronting right now. Almost the exact same geopolitical order in terms of 500 years ago. It's just that part of that geopolitical order exported itself to the United States. That became, like the honorary other European power. And so if that was true, then we should think about the fact that if it's that same geopolitical order, what it's going to look like if it's their job to administer this new environmental era. That's, our resident psychopath. So in the book, I try to develop what I call a Marshall theory of the Anthropocene, which I'll then call the Eurocene, but we'll wait for that for a second. And the goal behind that is to say that it's not just the kind of Marxist vision we have in Capitalocene or the kind of liberal vision where it was just like too much capitalism, but that almost all of these things were in service of war and geopolitical expansion from the beginning. In fact, one, of course, the first ice age, but of course that one was an accident, right? They didn't mean to spread disease everywhere else. The follow-up to that was not an accident, right? They took advantage of the apocalypse that happened in the Americas, and that advantage was taken with the fact that they had muskets, they had supplies of capital and resources that they could bring in, they could take advantage of the fact that whole civilizations had collapsed. And my argument is that that didn't really change. That actually what we have in the scaling up of capitalism more than 160 years later-ish from the first contact is just a maneuver in that direction. So I try to even read capital formation as a geopolitical phenomena rather than the other way around. And I've got some reasons for that, which we can go into in the Q&A, but I mean, just for starters, much more important, I think, than like double entry bookkeeping, movable, repeatable parts, which became the bedrock of the factory. The very first patent for those, not a spinning jenny. It was a musket. What were the first things made in factories? Guns. What were the first things that states in the modern form raised taxes for? Mining, to build guns. Right? So that we could read it as, sort of early proto-capital formation, or we could say that capitalism was what was necessary to make more guns. And that actually has a lot of explanatory power, too. So as Lewis Mumford said in 1940, the modern system, slavery at the bottom, caprice at the top, mechanization at the bottom, raw savagery at the top. This is what modern society has come to. And I actually think that vision in technology and civilization, or techniques and civilization, is a pretty good one. If we're thinking about the international system and how the global system works. And also, because this is a large part what the book's trying to deal with, this is the kind of scaling problem we're having all the time, right? So it's never just slavery at the bottom, right? It's also caprice at the top. It's never just mechanization at the bottom. It's also raw savagery at the top. We have a kind of ecology of relations where these technological transformations and transformation in forms of governance and the space at which that governance takes place. And then I argue the actual ecological or environmental spaces, right? So via Alfred Crosby, they turned America into a neo-Europe, right? They literally killed species, changed the trees. In Hawaii, they basically drained the whole thing so that they couldn't grow food anymore and made plantations. So rather than seeing climate as sort of the formative problem, I try to read war as something that's creative, not just destructive. That war and geopolitics were a project of terraforming planet Earth. And so when we talk about terraforming Mars or we talk about geoengineering Mars, that's not the first terraforming effort. The sort of geopolitical stretch from 1492 to the present is the largest terraforming experiment ever in history. And in fact, that's basically why large portions of the planet look the way that they do. And that this means making a really creepy claim, which a lot of people don't like, which is that war is creative. That war is a formative organizational force. And not just in the kind of like Schumpeter creative destruction sense, like you break a lot of stuff and then you can build new things, but literally like making new technologies. Almost every modern technology we have, from media to antibiotics to communications, was used in war, invented during wartime before it was used for civilians. And that actually says a lot about the kinds of institutionalized versions of what they created we now have. Right? So it shouldn't shock us if we take that perspective, for instance, that the internet gets used to spy on you. Right? I know that was a huge revelation after Snowden. I mean, not for anyone in this room, because you were already studying media politics, but like, it was a huge revelation to a lot of people. Well, that's pretty weird if you're like, well, yeah, except it was ARPANET and the military built it, and the entire NSA was organized around how to monitor it. And so, you like walked in the door, right? So it changes the kind of presumptions we have about different kinds of institutions, and also state formation, right? Of course, there's a wall at the border. And so I argue in the book that the general intellect is a martial intellect. I steal this obviously from Marx, right? That what we have is a kind of way in which war functions like what Deleuze-Guattari would call an abstract machine. It's not that things have to be organized this way, but the majority of technological innovation and settler colonialism is organized around a particular way of fighting war, which I call wars for annihilation, which came out of Europe and particularly the Napoleonic Wars. But were more importantly beta tested, because I have to play in Silicon Valley too, in the Americas, Africa, and Asia before they returned back to Napoleon. Right? So we have these crazy feedbacks, right, where war looks like a soccer match in Europe for a long time, but it definitely doesn't look like that in the Americas or in Africa, and then, right, it comes all the way back around. But not in the way that someone like Arendt would call the boomerang thesis. It actually had been going on from the very beginnings. Everybody knows Arendt's boomerang thesis. Basically, everybody went off to war after World War I. They brought totalitarianism home because of all the horrible things they did in the colonies. It's always smacked a little bit to me like Europe had something to lose in the first place. And I guess my argument is they were pretty wretched. Okay, so why the Eurocene? Because a lot of people were like, couldn't we just call it the capital scene? Couldn't we call it the geopolitical scene? Can't we just go back to the Anthropocene? Why are you so hard on Europe? First is that there's a real false universal humanism problem here, which depoliticizes the climate debates and the larger environmental debates. And we see that in every climate negotiation, right? Every time the United States is not willing to make deeper cuts than China, every time they're like, oh, hey, it's great that you're an indigenous peoples that still lives off the land, but there's this one species we don't want you to mess with anymore, so you don't have access to the land anymore. Right, like that's a history of resource management in the United States that goes back to the beginning of the Bureau of Indian Affairs, which is why I was in the Department of Interior. Actually, it was in the Department of War first, by the way, the Bureau of Indian Affairs, and then got moved to the Department of Interior, which I think fits my narrative. The second is that the sort of neo-Malthusianism, which I think is behind a lot of geoengineering and climate discussion, is deeply geopolitical. Right? It's always been a problem of big populations in particular places as opposed to other kinds of consumptive habits in small population areas. And that doesn't track with what we actually know about even carbon. Right? The majority of carbon, overwhelming majority of carbon, even with China going at full tilt, comes from the United States and Europe. Certainly historically, but still currently. And the fact that we think that it's somehow equal I think is a bit too convenient. The other is that I think CO2 obscures the majority of the problems that we're facing. It's not that climate change isn't really significant, but clean water, species loss, the homogenization and loss of cultures and languages, nuclear weapons, nuclear testing, ocean collapse, all sorts of things that climate change will most definitely make worse. But fixing climate change does almost nothing to resolve. Not to mention just the global system of injustice and maldistribution that exists, right? We can turn down the temperature on the planet and none of those change. Right? And the last is that, there's this kind of you broke it, you bought it logic, which is that the United States and Europe just need to ignore everybody else and go full steam ahead with geoengineering because everyone benefits from it. Not only do I think that obscures how we got here via settler colonialism, the other is that the reality is all the research we have now shows that turning down the temperature of the planet actually only helps the northern hemisphere. So it'll make winters and summers milder. But in the tropics, it will slow down the ocean currents and the weather patterns which renew soil with seasonal rains. So we'll basically get desertification in the tropical belt, which is also known as where most people live on the planet and are highly dependent on things like agriculture and fishing. It also rapidly acidifies the ocean, which again is fine if you want to drink soylent and eat sort of industrial meat, but not so good if you're dependent upon subsistence fishing. So what is the Euro and the Eurocene, right? Is this just another argument for Eurocentrism? It's a little more complex than that. So the Euro is an assemblage consisting of viruses, bacteria, remember what got the thing started, non-human animals, waste practices, a mechanistic worldview that thought that you could break things apart, put them back together, reorganize. That's how we're going to get to plasticity in a second. And finally, a form of statecraft emerging in the 16th century that relies on transoceanic expansion, primitive accumulation, and later capitalist development practices. And one that is executed almost exclusively through forms of combat and warfare. One thing that's important about this is that it also shifts how we understand the violence taking place. So one of the things that I say in the book is that actually even species lost is a bit of a misnomer. The kinds of violence created by the Eurocene are really based around homogenization. So it's not that there are fewer people living in the Americas now than there were in 1491. It's that there are different people who look a lot more alike and have particular lineages living here. That's also true of animals. We do not have a decline in biomass in the world, right? There are not fewer animals. The diversity of animals is significantly fewer. So that changes, I think, also the way that we think about things. Again, we don't have, we have more CO2, we have less O2. It's about the distribution. We have more people, but less languages, less form of life diversity. And I think similarly, this changes how we understand poverty. The reality is that most violence in poverty is not through pure deprivation. It's deprivation combined with an overwhelming surplus. Cheap calories that have no nutrition, garbage and too much water, but wastewater that can't be consumed. Right? That there is a kind of surplus or an abundance to the homogenization practice that's very different than the way that we understand impoverishment historically. And it looks like it's getting worse. Right? So I think one of the other sort of major reasons of wanting to put war and geopolitics at the forefront is that while everyone's suddenly excited that now a majority of Americans believe in climate change, right? And some liberals are even more excited that the U.S. military just came out and said that they think that they're going to collapse in 20 years if we don't do something about climate change, because it means the government believes in climate change. That merely believing in climate change actually does very little to re-articulate the relations of power and violence, which are the worst forms of the Anthropocene. And in fact, quite the opposite, given the relationship between emergency and politics and the ways that geopolitics tends to set the agenda for global action. We shouldn't expect that a sudden environmental consciousness will go well for most of the world. And in part, that's because of the way in which geopolitics takes up change. And so I take this term from Katrine Malibu, plasticity, which is something that can change itself. She mostly talks about the brain. But I'm interested in actually the ways in which plasticity became conscious of itself. So one of the things we see in geoengineering, and I'm going to talk about a couple of other scales very quickly, is that part of that Eurocene mission of geopolitics was this idea actually explicitly of terraforming. We see that back actually going all the way to the 1570s. That they were going to change the temperature of America by changing the trees. They were going to move natives by removing certain kinds of animals that they were dependent upon. That they were going to build cities to change the landscapes. That from the very beginning, geopolitics has been a politics of design. And that what's changing is not that politics of design, but the means and the scales at which things can be reformatted or re-engineered. So I'm going to talk about three very quickly, which I think are kind of at the forefront of the future, since I've mostly been talking in the past. And the first is the incredible interest in neuroplasticity. Right? So we're all really excited that brains, particularly children's brains, can be changed even after trauma. right, that we can reformat them in particular ways. This is a long-standing research agenda in the U.S. Army and Air Force in particular, starting after World War II, involving everything from selective lobotomies to all kinds of drugs, to deprivation tanks, to everything else, but has most recently become significantly invested in brain implants. So over 10,000 soldiers were implanted with tunable brain implants during the Obama administration, the so-called Brain Initiative, on the justification that it was the best way to treat PTSD. So these devices, right, which would allow you to inhibit or disinhibit particularly things that they had supposedly lost from PTSD, like control of rage or tendencies to abuse drugs and alcohol. This has taken a huge scale up recently, and it's been thought of now for alternatives to governance. And I want to think about this actually in the context of fake news, so you can see how it could become geopolitical very quickly. So for those who don't read all the tech wires, we sent the first email from brain to brain. So using no language, using only brain implants and a modem, they sent an email from one human brain to another human brain. And the second human brain knew what the first human brain had thought. Now, think about that for a second. Right, so the premise here is that we have all these great options, right? We can help people regain use of limbs that they've lost because of nerves. We can do all these different things. But I want to think about that already in the context of fake news. Imagine social platforms, or imagine governance, which is happening brain to brain so that it can skip language. Now, obviously, like cognitive things are structured by language, but just hold on to that for a second. A second one, plasticity already for many decades being used in social policy. And I'm going to actually read this because I find it incredible. It's from Lusa Gunther's research that she did on solitary confinement. So we've got one vision of plasticity, which is geopolitical already. We want to change minds, and that's actually how the research started. They wanted better propaganda. They wanted the ability to actually brainwash people, particularly prisoners of war. And it's now scaling up to networks. And then during the 1960s and 70s, we have it being thought of for social policy. In fact, a lot of the welfare reforms are based on it. And here's one from the National Representative of Prisoner Wardens. He says at their convention, "We have a tremendous opportunity here to carry on some of the experimenting to which the various panelists have alluded. We can manipulate our environment and culture. What I'm trying to say is that we are a group that can do a lot of experimenting and research, and we can change our methods, our environments, and perhaps come up with something more specific. What I'm hoping is the audience here will believe that we here in Washington are anxious to have you undertake some of these things. Doing things perhaps on your own. Undertake a little experiment of what you can do with Muslims. Undertake a little experiment what you can do with some of the sociopath individuals. You are thoughtful people with lots of opportunities to experiment. There's lots of research to do. Do it as individuals, do it as groups. Let us know the results." 1961, James Bennett, Director of the Bureau of Prisons. I will say that in addition to that, the Johnson administration was super interested in systems theory and hired a lot of the same people who are doing this research to try to work on the war on poverty, because the idea was they should be taking a cybernetic or systems approach to managing particularly black populations. So now let's scale back up, right? Same thing, right? We're not having political fights or using political persuasion. We want to backdoor engineer politics. So what happens when we think we can do it at the global level? Well, in albedo modification, that's what I was talking about before, there is a sense that we could change the color of the planet. But most importantly, the United States could do it without any assistance. It's cheap enough, it's expensive, but it's cheap enough that one country could decide the climate policy for the entire world. And the argument here is again an argument of plasticity, which is that design is preferable to politics. We'll never get consensus. No democratic means is going to do something about climate change, so we have to do something first. In the eco-modernist version that I talked about, it was again this vision of homogenization. We need to put everyone in the same kind of cities, we need the same kind of infrastructure for power, and most importantly, the thing that they want to talk about, decoupling from nature is hard, which means you need a very particular kind of governance. You need to be able to manage populations and cities at a scale that we've never seen before. And you have to manage conflict as well. And just think about that in the context of our warden friend just a second ago. And the other vision that we've been given, and the one that I come up against a lot in futures, is this vision of the singularity. How are we going to get out of this? We're going to shed our meat suits. Right? We're going to become post-human. We're going to upload the data. But no one talks about the data Malthusianism. Right? We don't have enough storage space for everybody. Who gets to go first? What kind of storage? Who gets to be stored in space where it's safer? Who gets to get stored in Antarctica where it melts and it fizzles out? But again, it's premised on this idea that we can upgrade humans through a kind of engineering, and that the engineering can get out of their understanding of a very limited notion of politics, which is basically scarcity. And that we should make that decision for a larger portion or population of the Earth. And so part of the thing that I'm trying to show in the book is that these are all new versions of geopolitics. Right? This is the settler colonialism of the 21st century. It's not just happening on land. It's certainly still happening on land. But it's also happening at the level of neuroscience, it's happening at the level of institutions, and it's happening at the level of global weather. Who gets to decide, in a very Schmittian way, what kind of political choices are made is made through an engineering decision as opposed to a political confrontation. And so the argument that the book kind of ends with, before I try to talk about a little bit of happy stuff, not that happy, is that this is an attempt to try to exit this Machiavellian world where the only two options the prince has is persuasion and coercion. Right? It wants to abandon fortuna. Right? It wants to dominate contingency in favor of a kind of pure virtue. Right? So much virtuosity that any conflict can be engineered out of. Any problem has a systems design solution. And that actually shouldn't surprise us because that's what settler colonialism was from the get-go. So we live in a world where power is as much about plasticity and control as it is about violence. It's much more supple, it's much more dispersed, and it's much harder to see in the making. But what we'll end up with is what I call an annihilating repetition. That everything becomes homogenization. And I'll end with this quote from Whitehead. He says, "A way of life is something more than the shifting relation of bits of matter in space and time. Life depends upon such external facts that all important aesthetics arises out of them and is deflected by them. But in abstraction from the atmosphere of feeling, one behavior pattern is as good as another, and they are all equally uninteresting." I think that's the cosmology and the worldview of geopolitics. One where moving things around, re-engineering things is where the action is, rather than the diversity and creativity that creates them. So, I think as a result that we have to significantly change how we're talking about environmental politics. We should be talking extensively and exclusively about how we should live rather than if we should live. I think the tyranny of survival has given the grounds and the emergency to geopolitics to steer this course, and it's likely to get a lot worse rather than a lot better. So, thanks. See, we can have animals in cyberspace. It would be great. Upload your consciousness.
You want to do your own questions?
Sure. Yeah, I think so.
Want some light a little bit?
Oh, yeah. If we wanted to bring light back, that would be cool. If you want to talk about me in the third person, I'm a he, him, his pronoun.
So, yeah, I've got a question about war.
Yeah.
And
Like, what the hell is it?
about your, I mean, so I'm interested in the argument, and I think it seems obviously persuasive that a lot of both change, positive and negative, that we've seen in the world, invention, creativity, comes from war. But I guess, so I have two different, questions. So one is, I wonder if you'd talk a little bit about what kind of an actant or agent war is. what's the status of war? And then I asked that question partly because one of the ways that I've been thinking about the current geopolitical situation is in terms of the sort of idea that in a closed system, particles move more quickly and end up colliding with each other and things like that. And I think if you think about the Earth, climate, whatever, in that way, that from that kind of perspective, that a lot of what we're seeing in terms of war, conflict, migration, and so forth might be understood as a consequence of, so rather than as a cause. So I guess I'd be interested, and those seem, I guess, related to me.
The first thing I want to say is that I'm actually very skeptical of we're having more war because things are getting more scarce, more crowded, the sort of, it's hot, crowded, and what was the third one for Friedman? I don't know. But hot and crowded, good enough. Right. The first is that it was sparsely populated and cold as hell for the first 100 years of settler colonialism in the Americas. The big problem with settler colonialism for the first 100 years was that the little ice age had made most of the Americas uninhabitable to Europeans. So most of the early European settlements failed. They either all ate each other or they decided to go off, and if they could find another group that had learned how to adapt better, they would join them. They just call it going native. Or they just didn't have any kids and they failed. And they kept going back. In fact, they kept going back and they kept upping the ante. So that suggests to me that if you're willing to carry something out for 100 years when it's not profitable and it's actually not survivable, and the entire project is murdering everybody who's there and making a new spot, then you're pretty resolved on doing it. I cannot think of a model of capitalism where you can carry out a project for 100 years with no profit and no success, and you keep doing it. So that 100-year period is a real enigma to that kind of explanation. The other is that that's also true of most of the settler colonial wars everywhere else, too. They weren't driven exclusively by population. So it is true that things like some of the colonialism in the post-French Revolution era, because we had these youth bulges in Europe, did help supplement the populations that could be sent out to be settler colonial. But the youth bulge in Europe actually only happened because of a change in agriculture, which was the introduction of the New World potato. Literally, settler colonialism itself is what produced the youth bulge, which then pushed people around to go off and murder people, set up little micro neo-Europes. And so I don't know. The other is that there's been other periods of time in which there have been crises on the planet and there hasn't been warfare. So none of those settler colonial wars were provoked. Right? And the whole model of, because people are doing this to try to explain the Syrian war now, which I do think there's a climate component to the Syrian war. I'm not dismissing that. But really, we're talking about that slight change in the access of water and resources, and we're not talking about the mandate system that set up the Middle East the way that it did and produced identity politics around. Do you know what I mean? Like there was a lot of things about the Syrian war which have to do with the way in which we have sometimes sided with Assad and not sometimes sided with Assad, and made particular kinds of geotechnical and geostrategic decisions. And what we want to talk about is that there might be a correlation in the less than one category, if you were doing regressions, between the temperature and the war. And I'm not saying, again, so I'm not saying it's not that, but it's interesting to me that and I'm an editor in IR Journal, I see tons of articles about the impact of climate change on warfare, which again there is. But I don't see so many articles about a lot of other causes for which there are more definitive actors who are responsible. So even there, I see this kind of weird depoliticization happening that I don't think is true. It's not just that I don't think it's helpful. It's just not true. And again, the Middle East looks like the Middle East does for very specific reasons that have almost nothing to do with climate change.
So on the first question, what kind of an agent or act
is war? I think that, so I make a little bit of a distinction between war and warfare in the book. Why? It's totally artificial. because I need war to be something kind of like an abstract machine, Angeles Guattari. It's a kind of attractor or form. And warfare is like a swarm of actants caught up in that form. So I think of war as a kind of organizational morphology, right? Because like all these technologies could have been used for other things, right? They didn't have to be used for war. In fact, none of them had to be used for war. But war was able to pull them into a certain kind of gravitational field, set of relations, that then gets kicked off by other machines like nationalism or capitalism or these others when it enters into contact with them. And so it's got a strange kind of ontological status, which I'm not super comfortable with, but I need because it's amazing how recurrent it is. Right? Like you got a thing that lasts 500 years and makes the world look pretty similar, in fact, increasingly more similar. You got to name it. Warfare, on the other hand, changes all the time. And that's because the actants that are involved really do change how the organization happens. So like automation is obviously changing the nature of warfare, right? Mercenaries are changing the nature of warfare. Precision weapons are changing the nature of warfare. But I don't think they've actually done that much to change the nature of war. And I have to be careful how I make that argument because IR has this whole history of trying to make the argument that war is a nature. Right, that war is sort of a human nature. And what I want to say is something like, yeah, war is natural in the Latourian sense, and that there is a natural history of warfare that has obviously affected evolution at all sorts of levels. But it's only evolution so far. It's not a determinism. We're not stuck with it. But we also shouldn't suspect that like something that literally changed the temperature of the planet, the movement of the oceans, the numbers of people, what languages were spoken, didn't change the biological and the whole system. And I actually think there's a better case to be made for that for war than there is for carbon. The irradiated center we now have around our planet, mostly from war. Most of the plastics around the planet from the get-go were started by war. There are more items of war than any other kind of artifact in the archaeological record. I don't know. I just want to give war its due.
So I'm intrigued by this, and I'm a historian, and so I want to. This is really useful, and I hadn't really factored the Little Ice Age into my thinking about anything, so I'm thinking it over. But if I understand you, I'm thinking about the Little Ice Age. So in the Americas, say 1600 to 1860-ish, Columbian exchange. Middle Passage, tremendous wealth in the triangle trade, tremendous wealth in the beaver pelts that I'm not sure why we need to disaggregate capital there.
Yeah. Well, the Little Ice Age is over by 1770, I believe.
Okay, well, I think that still the foundational Columbian exchange wealth transfer stands.
But from the beginning of the Little Ice Age for quite a long time, there was not a lot of beaver trade. There was a lot of collapse. Those early, the Santa Fe settlement collapses. Almost all of the ones around Jamestown collapse and have serious problems for at least 50 years. And they're not producing wealth. They didn't find the gold they were looking for. There's not a lot coming back to Europe for the first 50 years of settler colonialism. My argument is like capitalism doesn't wait around for 50 years to find a profit. And it's a little weird to think that in Spain, literally 6 different leaders had come and gone in the period of time that they're sending people back to the Americas. And I'm not saying that profit isn't a motive, but if it's the only one, it was a pretty terrible investment. And that seems interesting to me. It's also the case that there are lots of extractive economies which are not profitable, for which are pursued for geopolitical reasons. Tim Mitchell's done an incredible job with this in his Carbon Democracy book, but the reality is we are an oil economy for a geopolitical reason. Coal was cheaper, it was more readily accessible, and the US and British navies ran entirely on coal, and switching them to oil was extraordinarily labor-intensive and expensive. And it was done for exactly one reason, which is that Churchill he was the head of Interior at the time, wanted to crush the unions in Wales who were striking over coal. And in the United States, they wanted to crush the coal unions because they could literally turn the power on and off for both the country, the economy, and the war effort. And so they switched to oil because oil could be done through pipelines, not trains, which took a huge part of the labor out of it. And it could be done in the Middle East, not in places that could be held politically accountable. And he's produced the BP and other archives to show that that was a conscious decision. So it suggests to me that and it was going to cost money and they weren't going to make as much profit. And so it's not that I think capitalism doesn't exist or I don't think it's a driver, but it gets over-determined by geopolitics on a pretty regular basis. I don't know who was first. Yeah.
This is a great talk. Thank you so much. When you were talking about kind of where you see IR going up, not in a positive way, of course, but kind of the two things that stood out were plasticity and design, right? And the way I understood Malibu's plasticity, I mean, in a way, it's kind of the metamorphic nature of matter itself, right? And design is something which is sort of a more specific action, right? So I just want you to kind of place design and plasticity alongside each other because they're two very distinct things.
Well, distinct and not distinct. So it depends on who you ask. So plasticity is James's term, actually, from the Principles of Psychology. So it was used pretty extensively from the 1880s forward. He had taken it from some French neuroscientists. One of the Jamesian characters, which I think Malibu should focus on a bit more, is and actually she does in the recent AI lecture she's given, is that habit is really over-determining in a lot of cases. So this idea of plasticity of something that can form itself and affect itself is true, but there's a lot of structure that can be built in externally which can change that, not just the destructive plasticity, which he thinks about things like Alzheimer's and stuff like that. So there's two things. In the book, there's a distinction made between actual plasticity and the dream of plasticity. In cases of actual plasticity, there are all sorts of events where things totally backfire. So in the chapter I wrote on improvised explosive devices, they thought they could engineer the war in Iraq. The plasticity of garbage, old landmines, garage door openers, and cell phones meant that the United States got taken to the cleaners by an insurgency with almost no money very quickly because of the way that those things could be rearranged to make improvised explosive devices, which was the largest cause of casualties in both Afghanistan and Iraq. So plasticity explodes, right? It's part of Malibu's argument. Same thing in the neuroscience chapter, right? A lot of these experiments kill people. The problem, though, with holding that sort of formative, chancy version of plasticity at the level of the ideal is that the problem is that a lot of times plasticity as design works, which is to say that, I do think that memes helped elect Donald Trump. And that was acting on a particular plastic model quite effectively, and there wasn't a lot of chance involved. I think that some of the attempts at neuroengineering work in the sense that I don't think that there's like a little baby soul hiding in there that says, if you change my brain too much, I'll push back, right? And I don't think, by the way, I don't think that Malibu thinks that, but I think that the engineering side of plasticity is better than we give it credit for, and that should concern us, right? It should concern us that we can imagine a world where either at the meta level of engineering informatic ecologies or at the neurological level, either pharmaceutically or through brain implants and brain tuning, that you could not just change perceptions, but that you wouldn't miss the perception that changed. Right? If we take seriously that we're just our brains, right? That's where Malibu starts. Then there's the possibility of kind of erasing the fingerprints of change, which I think is radically different than the way that we normally understand persuasion or engineering or these other things. So oftentimes it fails, but it doesn't fail so much that we should do the kind of like skeptical of science thing where, well, don't worry about these things because you couldn't actually engineer a brain. I think they can and will, and they'll do plenty of violence along the way to do it. And the they is like tons of people, right? It's companies, it's governments, it's, Russia just announced they have a brain imaging program where they can visually watch people's ideas in real time. And they just put up all the images of it. It's pretty impressive. Resolution's not great. It's like when you used to watch TV on your computer in like 2002. It's glitchy. But I mean, watching somebody's ideas and what they're perceiving in real time, that's pretty crazy. mean, it's a new kind of surveillance for sure. You can see what they see without seeing what they see. Yeah, and then, yeah.
Just returning to the point of settler colonialism or other forms of colonialism. If I'm understanding your point correctly, you're trying to just ascertain what is the cause of this colonial activity, given the fact that there's no profit. But isn't this just the usual kind of garden variety effort to achieve hegemony, kind of pace the work of Giovanni Arrighi, Beverly Silver, et cetera? So states are willing to make long-term investments with losses for considerable portions of time in an effort to increase their position eventually within the world system.
So the book is not particularly interested in the why. That was a bit of a rabbit hole. It's more interested in the how. So what's more interesting to me is how you lock in hegemony without profit. And also part of it is because of the setup of the last part of the book, which is there is a bit of faith by people who think that capitalism is at the core of it, that think, oh, don't worry, we'll never fully automate, because if there's no labor, then you can't generate profit. And actually, I think there are a lot of reasons to believe that people will find new ways to extract value than through labor. And that automation may figure out ways to monetize, for instance, sadism, space expansion, any number of things, which I agree would be pursuing hegemony in different ways, but wouldn't necessarily pursue profit ever. And that's a weird thing to think about, but like you have to, right? Like Elon Musk's vision of Mars is one where the labor theory of value doesn't function. And it's terrifying, and it's probably really cruel, and it probably murders millions of people in the effort to get there. But you know what I'm saying? Like I actually think we have to think about how those systems functioned semi-autonomously of that long durée. Because if we go into another period, we need to think about what that becomes more broadly. And so much of the how of even how the hegemony was done was through plasticity, right? The whipping of slaves until they were willing to consent. The removal of names, the destruction of languages, the decision to use literacy sometimes, not use literacy other times, residential schools, right? For me, a residential school is a brain implant in the 18th and 19th century. The BIA is the birth of biopolitics in the United States. It was the first welfare program in the US. We modeled the rest of the welfare programs on that. That and the veterans program from the Civil War, one of which was, just to complete the circle, sending Civil War vets out to kill Indians because there was nothing else to do with them. And so in many cases, there was removal from lands that people didn't need yet because they needed to figure out what to do with some of these soldiers who were real good at killing people, and damn it, there was nobody left to kill. And of course, people like Otis who cut his teeth doing that, then they went off to the Philippines. And so there were like reservations in the Philippines that looked just like reservations in the US. And you see what I'm saying? Like, capital logic can explain how they got there. I think it can explain a lot of the logistics. I don't think it tells us a lot of how it got done. I think it only tells us one piece of the puzzle. Yeah. There was one in the, yeah.
Thank you. It was a lot of fun. You're real critical of these long-term plans for dealing with climate change, right? I think about a Green New Deal, right? Are you similarly critical of that, or do you see that as something altogether different and disconnected?
Yeah, I mean, I like the Green New Deal because the assholes are on the other side. I don't think the Green New Deal is a good idea at all. But at the very least, the people mobilizing for it are people who think that we should treat people decently, that sadism shouldn't be the organizing logic of our government, and that we should try to do something. Here's where I think the New Deal could go horribly off the rails. Labor in the United States has a really nasty history of being very particular, causing infighting and being used to pit racial groups and immigrant groups against each other. It's been used as often or not to close the borders as open them. And so I think it's a great buzzword to say that the Green New Deal puts justice first and then does the economy. But there's two problems with that. The first is that justice for whom is a really hard problem. And the United States has a really terrible history for it. I mean, literally the black farmers that were supposed to benefit from the Department of Agriculture just won their lawsuit like last year. And the lawsuit's been going on since 1895, I think. So, you know, like goods don't get distributed very well in the US. That's sort of the first problem. The second is that it's still premised on this idea, which I don't think there's any guarantee of, which is that the whole world can look like middle-class America. And if it can't, then only the US can look like middle-class America, and I promise you that will go badly. Right? So many of the ways in which Keynesianism works in the United States, for the same reason it works in Northern Europe, is because it lives off of something else, right? It moves the suffering around. And I don't think that we have a model for that doesn't do that yet. And I certainly don't think the Green New Deal has a vision for how that works. So, you know, yeah, I'm going to vote for whoever says they're for the Green New Deal, but I don't think the Green New Deal is going to, it's not going to change that calculus, right? And that seems to me to be if we really were putting justice first, right, we'd have to ask those questions, which is like, how do you produce a space privileged enough to have those kinds of resources to do a Green New Deal that doesn't involve fighting a bunch of wars for cheap energy or, you know, I mean, a big part of the Green New Deal is tech. And if you think oil extraction looks bad, you should look at what rare earth mineral extraction looks like. And why we don't even do it in the United States. The only reason we do rare earth mineral extraction in the United States is because the US military figured out that China cornered the market. And so we do it a little bit, and it's all in a strategic stockpile because it's so toxic and so dangerously labor intensive. So, you know, I don't know, like, I don't mean to be like rain on the AOC parade because she's pretty awesome, but no. Yeah. Oh, sorry, I think, yeah, I don't even know anymore. And then,
oh, thanks.
Yeah.
No, fascinating and terrifying talk. You're and a lot of fun. The way you're framing war machines, we can think of multiple machines, right? You could have there's a finance machine, capital machine, you know, science machine, and they all have their coded logics, slightly different logics from each other. So what makes you, I mean, so why, how are you, so to me, the reality kind of, you know, is produced through the interactions between these different abstract machines. How are you able to kind of privilege or, you know, or make war machine over-determine different aspects?
I mean, for both historical and theoretical reasons. So historical reasons, there's not another machine that has been able to put the other machines in full mobilization or even at a halt, right? Imagine a world not involving war in the United States where the United States population accepts rationing. Seriously, like a planned economy, right? The United States was able to have a planned economy because of war. It's actually, James has a great essay that no one reads anymore because the end of it's like disgustingly, horribly racist and embarrassing, but the top of it's really interesting, which is called the moral equivalent of war. And one of the arguments he makes is that you can't go after war by trying to get rid of it, because we have to figure out how to harness all that energy to do the things that we want to do. If people can't figure out how to get a hold of the affective engines of war and put them to use in other ways besides enmity, then we're lost, right? Like there's just, it's not going to work. And like I love that idea, but the reality is like economic crisis has never created the ability to just completely monopolize science. Science has never been able to create the ability to completely monopolize economy or completely monopolize war. And if it had, we probably wouldn't have war. So, I mean, it's, you know, like the good Deleuzian complexity theorist, new materialist to me was like, it's all flat, it's all horizontal. But like the reality is like there are machines amongst machines, and the abstract machine of war for the last 500 years, I don't think that was always true, but for the last 500 years has been more determinative of relationality, I think, than any other machine. And, you know, part of that is like even non-capitalist states. I mean, Soviet Union does not have a good track record on imperialism and war making, nor does North Korea, or, I mean, there are plenty of economies. I mean, granted, they live in a capitalist, me and my Marxist friends, we go round and round, sure. But the point is that, like, it's hard to come up with an example of another machine that can literally put all the other machines on hold or entirely direct them towards their effort. So that's interesting to me, and yeah.
I think I don't know that it's fun exactly, but it is fantastic. Oh, sorry.
Bombastic? Can we say that?
Oh, I said fantastic, but I like bombastic.
Yeah.
But perhaps following up on Anisha's question, and I keep having to reformulate my question as you keep introducing new questions. But I'll try to zero in on one or two things. You introduce this notion of martial theory, which I think is potentially really important, and I hope your book. I've started your book, and I think it may well be an important book. I mean, I think it's an excellent book.
Okay.
Time will tell whether it's an important book,
Yeah.
and what that even means. But one concern I have as to whether it will gain traction is that you're clearly intent on when you're critical of other people's terms, say the Anthropocene, what have you, you've several times said it's depoliticizing. At the same time as you've kind of jettisoned this reference to politics as the ground for normative reason, or as your central term.
Yeah.
And so I wonder on what ground you stand when you say it's depoliticizing, and yet what you're calling for is a Marshall theory.
Yeah.
And then I think this is a unrelated question, but maybe not. One of the things. So I've been using your syllabi and your website for years, and it's partly so enjoyable. It's so pretty, and your aesthetic sense is very keen, but enjoyable in a way that I find a bit unnerving. And to the extent that your book is itself like a residential school, kind of a brain implant, what's the kind of work that your book is, or your argument is doing at the level of persuasion?
Try to take all three in quick order. The first is that I don't want to get rid of political theory. I don't want Marshall theory to supplant it. But I do think that there's two senses in which Marshall theory exists independently. The first is that there are a number of philosophers who are also very good political theorists who wrote about war as having its own logic. I mean, think about Levinas and the way that he thinks through war at the beginning of Totality and Infinity. And war is something very different than the ethical and the political, and it is like a direct confrontation with becoming, perhaps, and like a concern, right? It's literally how the book ends and begins. But we don't generally think about Levinas as a theorist of war. It's true of Whitehead. Whitehead said he literally had his transformation from the rationalist logical version of himself with Russell to the one that was like, oh my gosh, the world is both chaotic and creative, and there are these rhythms. He said it was the punctuating shell fire of war and the fact that his son got killed in the war. Keynes, by the way, similarly said, like literally his thought was interrupted by war. And then we have all of these like soldiers who wrote incredible works of philosophy, some of them super creepy, but all really interesting, like J.F.C. Fuller, who wrote this huge book on the philosophical foundations of warfare and affect theory, because he thought affect theory was core to understanding how you could get people to hold together, even when they were getting shot at and killed. And he was reading Freud, and so like, as an intellectual history question, we have this like whole body of stuff, and we either ignore it, sideline it, or make it political. And I think when it's talking about the logic of war, it should get to hang out in that logic before it gets transported. I mean, think about how often like we do that to Foucault. Foucault talks about war often, and we're like, but it's a metaphor. And actually, when he really does talk about war, it's not so good. So like, it's interesting. The second part is a tactical, practical question, which is, I think depoliticization is very important in the ways in which agenda setting happens in international fora, in the United States, in public discourse. Just because I believe in materiality doesn't mean I don't believe in language and persuasion and rhetorical tools. And I don't think there is a Marshall force behind that depoliticization, but I don't think that there's a Marshall theory of depoliticization. And I'd want to hold those two in parallel rather than trying to pick one over the other. And the third one is, isn't this super creepy? this happened in my original job talk. The guy who I ended up replacing said, "Wow, you really love war." And I was like, "Oh, hey." There's the kind of two-part answer to this real fast. One is you have to be a little fascinated and seduced by it to take it seriously. You know, I had a long-term, love affair, which still exists, of protest and organization and labor politics and anti-war politics, and that hasn't stopped. But if I'm not willing to sit in a room at West Point and listen to people talk about their experiences in Iraq and Afghanistan and how that's changed their understanding of nation building even being possible, wanting to know if they could withdraw, if I can't do that and not be like, you're a baby killer, and some of them are, then I can't figure this stuff out. And so I do think that there's like a practical side to that of just like making a little bit of peace that this is super horrifying. I benefit from it every single day. And that we're all going to war all the time. If I always say this, like if you drove your car here today, you participated in war. Like really participated in war. And they're like, no, I have an electric car. And it's like, you really participated in war, right? Like those batteries, right, are acts of violence. They are entirely built into an economy of warfare. And they're structured by that economy. That's the reason they have the price points that they do. We export externalities to conflicts, and we resolve the externalities through conflicts. So I don't, but it's, I read a bunch of James, and I was a Jane and Bill student, so I know that like if I don't hack your brains, you're not going to like my ideas because we're not little rational agents where I just present my case and you say, aha, let me stand back and decide what I think about that. I make things move on the screen, and because the other side's going to do that. They do it all the time. That's why Fox News exists.
But you're the first person I see who does it really well.
No, lots of people do it well. But, I want to be as good as Fox News. I've been fighting with the Proud Boys a lot lately. These are the neo-fascists on my campus. They're pretty good at memes, but we can be better. They're pretty good at using the internet. We can be better. These people are terrorizing our classrooms. They are threatening the lives of our students and our faculty. And they are native to an environment of mediation that we just got to get a lot better at. It sucks. I'd rather just sit around with books. But yeah. I think there was another. I feel like there was a. No? Richard's going to go?
I've got it. I'll
Yeah.
follow. So as you were talking about war in the last couple of questions, I think to Nish in particular, but then in your answer to Ivan, the question of affect came up. And one of the ways that you distinguished war from other machines was, you said, is there any other machine that could generate a kind of collective affect in such a way as to get the United States, for example, to accept rationing? And then at the beginning, you were sort of distinguishing between war and war making.
Yeah.
And so I guess my question is whether martial theory or whether war could be fought by other means. And the means I'm particularly thinking of today are media.
Yeah.
And whether, for example, what we call Trump's war on the media, or Trump's, what I've been thinking of is sort of the terroristic nature of his Twitter feed and of his social media, which, I think I may now start just calling that war. I mean, would that or could that, in your sort of understanding of martial theory, be another way of war making? That is, can war making happen? I mean, and that would just be one, for example, but I mean, that's one right now that seems actually like a decent candidate.
Yeah. I actually had a big fight over this piece that's coming out, I think in 2 weeks. People should check out because I really liked writing. It's the first thing I wrote collaboratively with two other people, which is really hard to do. One person's hard enough, a third's really hard, but I liked how it came together. It's on martial empiricism, but one of the fights was over whether or not we could call incel mass shooters warfare. And my argument in favor of it was that it is organized and mobilized by the Twitter feed of Trump and many others. And that we shouldn't draw a strict distinction between like Theodore Roosevelt's guts and garters speech, which is more explicitly about going to a particular war, and the ways in which affect is generated mobilized, and coded to be a surplus resource for outsourced forms of what I call violence entrepreneurship, where it's not that Trump has to like tip off one of these shooters, but like that's how the system works, right? You turn up the affective intensity enough and you build certain kinds of narratives and targets, and then you increase the tempo and the pacing, and then you have one shot fired, right? And like then you get other shooters, right? You know, I think so. I think the media has always been a component of warfare for sure. The question is, could you fight a war entirely by media?
The question is whether the tweets themselves, not that the tweets stimulate the incel mass shooting, but whether the tweets themselves are weapons of war. Let's say that would be
sure. I'm happy to say that, but here's what I will say, because you know. This was a huge
because they mobilize a lot of resources.
This was a huge actual like debate in the 90s about like what constituted cyber war, which are now having all over again because of all the info war stuff. Mm-hmm. And one of the things that I will say is that will be the Marshall equivalent of depoliticization. At times, the effort to focus on informatics obscures the material interfaces of those media practices, which involve really clumsy old versions of war at the same time. So they're almost never disconnected. And so I think there's sort of like a double marshalling, demarshalling of the info warfare debates, where it's only info war if it causes kinetic damage, meaning it actually breaks something, or it's only media war if it doesn't do that. And that's sort of the debate. And it's never one or the other. And you know, the best example of that is there's not a single tweet, good or bad, that doesn't require murdering a bunch of people in Peru. Right? You're going to go off looking for some lithium to run these batteries. Like, you're going to go murder some people. Mm-hmm. And so part of the problem is that I think a lot of the debates over cyber war and media war think that the connection between media and warfare is based on the intentionality of the enmity of the particular tweets, as opposed to seeing the entire informatic environment being a structure of warfare, which sometimes gets used for good tweets, but mostly, you know, I don't know what the percentages are these days, but they're not good. So does that make sense? So I think it's almost impossible to answer, like, could you have a war with just media? And I think the answer is, I don't think there's such a thing as just media, right? I'm on the media archaeology side. I know you are.
And
too,
I wouldn't formulate the question.
Yeah, no, I know that.
Yeah.
But that's where, weirdly, that's where a lot of the debates end up, in the kind of like hyper war, Baudrillard-esque war games that now the United States plays.
Thanks. All right, well, I've got the mic. Before we thank Jairus, let me invite all of you to come up to the 9th floor. And we've got some refreshments and a view of the last time you'll see daylight at 5 o'clock for at least the next couple of months. So anyway, please join us upstairs, and thank you.